folded the letter with steady hands, the sharp creases slicing through the thick, expensive paper, like the words had sliced through me while I wrote them. It felt like shedding skin, peeling back layers of resentment I'd been too afraid to voice for years. I left it on the kitchen table, right next to the chipped coffee mug Daniel used every morning. The irony wasn't lost on me. That mug, like our marriage, had cracks we'd both ignored for far too long. I stood in the doorway for a moment, staring at the small, perfect world we'd built together in Maplewood. The polished hardwood floors Daniel insisted on waxing every Sunday morning. The framed photographs of vacations we'd taken when things still felt good. The scent of fresh lavender from the candle I lit every evening, trying to make the house feel warmer than it really was. But it wasn't warm. Not anymore. With a final glance at the letter, I grabbed my purse and walked out the door, letting it close softly behind me. I didn't slam it. I didn't need to. The letter would do that for me. The autumn air outside was crisp, tinged with the faint scent of burning wood from the neighbors' fireplaces. I walked down the tree-lined street, the crunch of leaves beneath my boots drowning out the doubts whispering at the edges of my mind. You're doing the right thing, I told myself. You deserve more. Daniel wouldn't fight me on this. He never fought for anything. That was the problem. His calm, measured way of moving through life had once been comforting, like a steady anchor. But over time, that anchor felt more like a chain, dragging me deeper into a life that felt too small, too predictable. I wanted more passion, more excitement, more of something. And Daniel wanted exactly what he had. That's why I left the letter. I wanted to watch the world we built burn, just a little. I wanted to know if anything beneath that composed exterior would crack when he read my words. Would he crumble? Would he beg me to stay? Or would he just sit there sipping his coffee from that damn chipped mug, unmoved? I didn't know which answer terrified me more. I spent the day trying to lose myself in distractions, shopping downtown, meeting Sophie for lunch, even wandering through the little art gallery Daniel and I used to visit when we were first married. But no matter what I did, the thought of that letter haunted me. Had he read it yet? The sun dipped low over Maplewood, casting long shadows across the streets as I finally made my way back home. The walk felt heavier than it had that morning, each step pulling me toward a truth I wasn't sure I was ready to face. The house was silent when I opened the door, the kind of silence that presses against your ears until it becomes deafening. I kicked off my boots, my heart pounding as I walked into the kitchen. And there it was, a letter, right where mine had been. But it wasn't mine. It was his. I stared at the envelope, my name written in Daniel's neat, deliberate handwriting. My hands trembled as I picked it up, the paper cool against my skin. This wasn't the reaction I'd expected. I'd imagined an argument, maybe even a heated confrontation. But this felt worse. I unfolded the letter slowly, the weight of it settling in my chest before I even read the first word. Claire, thank you for your letter. I appreciate your honesty, though I must admit it wasn't entirely unexpected. You've laid out your grievances with impressive precision, and for that, I commend you. You mentioned feeling invisible. Perhaps that's true. But you see, Claire, invisibility is a two-way street. I've smiled at you across the dinner table, too, wondering if you saw me. I've felt the space between us in bed at night grow colder long before you noticed. You accuse me of indifference, and maybe you're right, but let's not pretend you were blameless in creating this distance. The routine you now resent was once the very thing you cherished. You praised our stability, our quiet life. So when did that change? But I know when. I've known for some time. It's hard to miss the signs of an affair when it's with your best friend. I stopped reading, my heart slamming against my ribcage so hard it felt like it might crack. He knew. He'd known this whole time. My eyes darted back to the letter, my hands shaking as I forced myself to keep reading. I could have confronted you, but I didn't. I wanted to see how long you'd keep up the charade, how long you'd pretend everything was fine while slipping further away. But now you've saved me the trouble. I won't beg you to stay, Claire. I won't fight for something you've already thrown away. Instead, I'll thank you. Your letter has given me clarity. It's freed me to pursue the happiness you claim I denied you. I wish you the best in your search for whatever it is you're looking for. I hope you find it. Yours truly, Daniel. I dropped the letter onto the table, the room spinning around me. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He was supposed to be devastated, broken. He was supposed to need me. But Daniel was free. And I was suddenly the one left behind. I stared at Daniel's letter long after the words had blurred into meaningless shapes on the page. The silence in the house, once comforting, now felt suffocating, like the walls themselves were mocking me. He knew. That simple truth looped in my mind like a broken record. He knew about me and Ethan, had known for God only knows how long, and yet he never said a word. No screaming matches, no accusations, not even a passive-aggressive comment. Just silence. That infuriating, soul-crushing silence. But the worst part? He wasn't angry. He was free, and that made me feel more trapped than ever. I didn't sleep that night. My mind kept replaying every moment, every glance, every quiet evening Daniel and I had shared, wondering when he'd first suspected. Had he known when I lied about late nights at work? When I came home smelling faintly of Ethan's cologne? Or was it something simpler, a look in my eyes he recognized as belonging to someone else? By morning, the restless energy had twisted itself into something sharp and bitter. I needed answers, and there was only one person who could give them to me: Ethan. The cafe was quiet when I arrived, the morning crowd long gone, leaving behind the faint aroma of espresso and freshly baked bread. I spotted him immediately, sitting at our usual corner table, his hands wrapped around a coffee cup like it could ground him in reality. For a moment, I hesitated at the door, watching him. He looked the same, tall, effortlessly charming, that lazy smile that had once made my heart race. But now, all I felt was a gnawing resentment curling in my stomach. I pushed the door open, the little bell above it jingling sharply. Ethan looked up, and for a split second, relief flashed in his eyes. But when he saw my expression, it vanished, replaced by something closer to dread. "Claire," he greeted, standing up as I approached. "I was starting to think you wouldn't come." I slid into the seat across from him, my eyes narrowing. "Why? Guilty conscience?" He flinched, just slightly, but enough for me to notice. "Good. Let him squirm. I didn't mean for any of this to happen," he began, his voice low, like we were conspiring instead of confronting the mess we'd made. "Oh, please," I snapped, leaning forward. "Don't give me that I didn't mean it crap. You knew exactly what you were doing." Ethan ran a hand through his hair, his charm unraveling at the edges. "It was supposed to be fun. We were just having fun, Claire, you said." "I said a lot of things," I hissed, cutting him off. "And now look where we are." The weight of Daniel's letter pressed against me like a physical force. I thought I'd feel powerful walking out on my husband. I thought Ethan would be there, waiting, ready to pick up the pieces. But now I saw him for what he really was, a coward. "I didn't think Daniel would find out," Ethan muttered, his gaze dropping to his coffee. I laughed, bitter and sharp. "You think that's the problem?" He knew, Ethan. He knew, and he didn't care. Ethan's head snapped up, confusion flickering in his eyes. "What do you mean?" I pulled Daniel's letter from my bag and slapped it on the table between us. "Read it." He hesitated, but curiosity got the better of him. As his eyes scanned the page, I watched the color drain from his face. "Shit," he breathed, leaning back in his chair. "He's calm." "Too calm," I whispered, the words tasting sour on my tongue. For the first time, I realized Daniel's calm wasn't weakness. It was control. He wasn't the passive husband I'd painted him as in my mind. He was strategic, deliberate. And worst of all, he was done with me. Ethan scrubbed a hand over his face, his facade of confidence crumbling. "What are we supposed to do now?" "We," that word hung in the air, heavier than it should have been. "There is no we, Ethan," I said quietly, the truth settling over me like a shroud. "You made that clear." His eyes darted to mine, pleading. "Claire, come on. You know I care about you." I shook my head, standing up. "No, you care about not being the bad guy in this story." He reached for my hand, but I pulled back like his touch burned. "I need to figure things out," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "and I don't need you to do it." I walked out of that cafe without looking back, the cool morning air biting at my skin. But it wasn't the weather that made me shiver. It was the realization that, for the first time, I was truly alone. And Daniel was the one who set me free. The drive home felt longer than it should have. The roads in Maplewood, usually familiar and comforting with their winding paths and golden autumn leaves, felt alien under my tires. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, knuckles whitening with every mile that passed. Ethan's words echoed in my head. It was supposed to be fun. Fun. Like I was some weekend hobby he could pick up and toss aside when it got too complicated. And Daniel? His calm, measured letter haunted me even more. He didn't yell. He didn't cry. He didn't need me. The worst part? I wasn't sure if I wanted him to. When I pulled into the driveway, Daniel's car was gone. The house loomed before me, its white shutters and neatly trimmed hedges now feeling like the walls of a prison I'd built for myself. I stepped inside, the familiar creak of the wooden floor beneath my feet making my stomach twist. The silence was deafening. I dropped my purse on the table, my eyes falling once again on Daniel's letter. I should have thrown it away, but I couldn't. It sat there like a challenge, daring me to make the next move. I didn't know what that move was. The days passed in a blur. Daniel came and went with the same calm detachment he'd written into his letter. He didn't avoid me, but he didn't seek me out either. We existed in the same space like two strangers renting different rooms in the same house. I tried to act normal, cooking dinner, cleaning the house, sticking to our old routines. But Daniel didn't bite. He'd eat in silence, or worse, come home late with some vague excuse about work. And when he was home, he'd retreat to the study, the door clicking shut behind him like a final word. It was like trying to hold water in my hands. The more I tried to grip, the faster it slipped through my fingers. One evening, I found him in the kitchen, his sleeves rolled up as he rinsed dishes in the sink. The sight was so painfully domestic it made my chest ache. "Daniel," I began, my voice tentative. He didn't look up. I swallowed hard, gathering the courage I wasn't sure I had. "I think we should talk." He placed the last dish in the drying rack, wiping his hands on a towel before finally meeting my gaze. "About what?" he asked, his tone neutral, like we were discussing grocery lists instead of the wreckage of our marriage. I took a deep breath. "About us." There was a flicker of something in his eyes, amusement maybe or disbelief, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "What's left to talk about, Claire?" he asked quietly. "You said what you needed to say in your letter." "That was different," I protested, my voice rising despite myself. I was angry. I didn't mean all of it. He raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "Which part? The part where I'm indifferent? Or the part where you're leaving me?" I flinched, the words hitting harder than I expected. "I made a mistake," I whispered. Daniel's lips curled into something that might have been a smile, but there was no warmth in it. "Yeah, Claire, you did." And just like that, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving me standing there with nothing but the echo of my own regrets. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the emptiness beside me colder than it had ever felt when Daniel was there. I kept replaying his words, his calm demeanor, his control. I'd wanted to shake him, to make him feel something, anything. But Daniel wasn't the man I thought I'd married. He was stronger, sharper, and somehow that made me feel even smaller. I reached for my phone, my thumb hovering over Ethan's name before I thought better of it. Ethan wasn't the answer, but I didn't know what was. A week later, Daniel dropped the bomb. I was in the kitchen making coffee when he walked in, dressed for work, his tie perfectly knotted, his jacket slung casually over his shoulder. "I filed the divorce papers," he said simply, as if he were telling me we were out of milk. The coffee mug slipped from my fingers, shattering against the floor. "What?" I gasped, my heart slamming against my chest. He didn't flinch, didn't react to the shards of ceramic at his feet. "I filed the papers. You'll get them in a few days." I stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in like stones in my stomach. "But I thought we could fix this." Daniel's gaze softened, just slightly, but his voice remained firm. "You made your choice, Claire. I'm just making mine." He turned to leave, pausing at the doorway. "Oh, and Claire," his eyes met mine, cold and steady, "don't wait up tonight." And with that, he was gone. I sank to the floor, the broken pieces of the mug cutting into my knees, but I didn't care. Daniel had filed for divorce. I was losing him. And for the first time I realized I wanted him back. The divorce papers arrived 3 days later. I stared at the envelope, my name and Daniel's printed side by side like they were already a memory, not a marriage. My hands trembled as I tore it open, the weight of the crisp legal documents heavier than I could have imagined. It was official. Daniel had beaten me to the punch. He wasn't waiting for me to change my mind. He'd already made up his. I sat at the kitchen table, the same one where I'd left my letter just weeks before, and tried to process the surreal twist of it all. I had been the one to threaten divorce, to declare my dissatisfaction with our predictable life. But Daniel had flipped the script, and now I was the one staring down the barrel of a future I didn't want. What the hell happened? The answer was simple, really. Daniel happened. I spent the next few days in a daze, replaying every moment of our marriage like a movie stuck on repeat. I thought about the quiet nights on the couch, the lazy Sunday mornings, the soft way he used to say my name when I wasn't paying attention. I'd called it boring, lifeless, but now I realized it was comfort, it was home, and I'd thrown it away. By the time the weekend rolled around, I was desperate. I needed to see him, to talk to him, not as the calm, detached stranger he'd become, but as the man I'd married. I waited until Saturday evening when I knew he'd be home. The familiar sound of his car pulling into the driveway made my heart race. I smoothed my hair, wiped my sweaty palms on my jeans, and tried to rehearse what I'd say. But when Daniel walked through the door, all my carefully crafted words evaporated. He looked different, lighter, like someone who had finally let go of a burden he didn't realize he was carrying. And it wasn't just his posture or the ease in his expression. It was the faint scent of someone else's perfume clinging to his clothes. "Daniel," I blurted, stepping into his path before he could retreat to his study like he had every other night. He raised an eyebrow, his face unreadable. "Claire." I swallowed hard, pushing past the lump in my throat. "Can we talk?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Claire, we've talked. You made your feelings clear, and now so have I." "No," I said, shaking my head. "Not like that. I was wrong." For the first time, something flickered in his eyes. Surprise? Amusement? I couldn't tell. "Wrong about what?" he asked, his voice calm, steady, too steady. I took a deep breath, my heart pounding. "About us. About everything." I thought I wanted excitement, but what I really wanted was you. Silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. I waited for him to soften, to step closer, to care, but he didn't. Instead, he chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You don't get to do this, Claire." My stomach twisted. "Do what?" "Decide when I'm worth it," he said quietly, his gaze piercing through me. "You wanted out. You left me, remember?" I felt the sting of his words like a slap. I was confused. I thought, "You thought I'd just be here, waiting for you to figure it out." His voice was low, controlled, but I could hear the edge beneath it. "But I'm done waiting, Claire." Panic surged in my chest. "Daniel, please, we can fix this. We can." "No," he interrupted, his tone final. "You can't fix this." He moved past me, heading toward the stairs. But before he disappeared, he paused, glancing over his shoulder. "Oh," he added, his voice casual, almost amused. "And don't worry about the papers. I've already signed them." I stood there long after he was gone, the words echoing in my head like a cruel joke. I had lost him, not because of the affair, not because of the letter, but because Daniel had finally realized he deserved better. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in years. I went to Sophie's. Her house was just a few doors down, the same white picket fence and manicured lawn as ours, but it felt worlds away. Sophie answered the door in her usual effortless style, messy bun, yoga pants, and a knowing look that made me want to turn around and run. But I didn't. Instead, I stepped inside and let the words pour out, the letter, the affair, Daniel's reply, and the divorce papers that now sat like a ticking time bomb on my kitchen table. When I finished, Sophie was quiet for a long moment. Then she let out a low whistle. "Wow," she said finally. "You really screwed this up, huh?" I groaned, burying my face in my hands. "Thanks, Soph. Really helpful." She laughed, but it wasn't cruel. It was the kind of laugh only a friend who's seen you at your worst can give. "You don't need advice, Claire," she said, her tone softening. "You need to figure out why you did this in the first place." I frowned, looking up. "What do you mean?" "You didn't blow up your marriage because Daniel was boring," she said simply. "You blew it up because you didn't know who you were without him." The words hit harder than I expected. I opened my mouth to argue, but she was right. I'd spent so much time blaming Daniel for the emptiness I felt, but the truth was, that emptiness had been inside me all along. That night, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the divorce papers. For the first time, I didn't feel anger or panic. I felt clarity. Daniel was right. He deserved better. And maybe so did I. The divorce papers sat on the kitchen counter for 3 days before I worked up the nerve to open them. I'd walked past them dozens of times, each glance sending a fresh wave of nausea rolling through me. They felt like a bomb, ticking down to the moment I had to confront the reality I wasn't ready to face. But on the third night, after another empty dinner in an empty house, I finally ripped the envelope open. The words stared back at me, cold, clinical, final. Petition for dissolution of marriage. There was no emotion in the legal language, no trace of the man who used to hold me in the middle of the night, whispering promises about forever. Just Daniel's signature at the bottom, as neat and precise as everything else about him. I stared at the paper, my vision blurring. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. I was the one who wanted out. I was the one who wrote the letter. But Daniel had beaten me to it, filing first, as if I was nothing more than a loose end he needed to tie up. And it hurt. I spent the next few days oscillating between anger and regret. I kept thinking about all the things I'd said in that letter, the accusations I'd hurled at him. I'd called him indifferent, but maybe I was the one who'd been blind to the man who had been quietly holding our life together while I chased after something I didn't even understand. I thought about reaching out to Ethan again, but the memory of our last conversation stopped me. He wasn't the man I thought he was either. And maybe, just maybe, I wasn't the woman I thought I was. Sophie showed up on my doorstep the following Saturday, uninvited, holding a bottle of wine and that no-nonsense look she always wore when she knew I was about to spiral. "Open up," she called through the door. "I know you're in there, Claire." I sighed, pulling the door open. "I'm not really in the mood, Soph." "Tough." She pushed past me, heading straight for the kitchen. "You're drinking this with me, and we're going to talk about whatever this is." She gestured vaguely around the house, as if the walls themselves were holding on to the tension I couldn't shake. I followed her reluctantly, collapsing onto the bar stool as she uncorked the wine and poured 2 generous glasses. "So," she said, sliding one toward me. "How's it going with Daniel?" I let out a bitter laugh. "He filed for divorce." Her eyebrows shot up. "Wait, he filed?" "Yep." Sophie took a slow sip of her wine, eyeing me over the rim of the glass. "Damn, didn't see that coming." "Yeah, well, neither did I." She set her glass down, leaning forward. "Do you still love him?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd been avoiding it for weeks, burying it under anger and denial. But now, faced with Sophie's bluntness, I couldn't dodge it. "I don't know," I whispered. "I thought I didn't. I thought I wanted something more. But now that he's walking away, you're not so sure." I nodded, feeling the tears prick at the corners of my eyes. Sophie sighed, reaching across the counter to squeeze my hand. "Claire, sometimes we don't realize what we have until it's gone. But the real question is, do you want him back because you love him, or because you hate losing?" I didn't have an answer. Not yet. The next day, I found myself parked outside Daniel's office, staring up at the sleek glass building where he worked. I hadn't planned to come here, but my car had a mind of its own, pulling me toward him like a magnet. I sat there for nearly an hour, rehearsing what I'd say if I saw him. "I'm sorry, I was wrong. Let's try again." But the words felt hollow, even in my own head. Finally, just as I was about to give up and drive away, I saw him. He stepped out of the building, his jacket slung over his shoulder, his face relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in years. And then I saw her. She was standing next to him, laughing at something he'd said. She was pretty, too pretty, with dark hair and a confident smile that made my stomach twist. Daniel leaned in slightly, his hand brushing her arm, and the casual intimacy of the gesture hit me like a slap. I sat frozen, watching as they walked down the street together, their heads close, their laughter trailing behind them like a ghost. He's moved on. The realization settled over me like a thick fog. I'd been so focused on how I felt, on what I wanted, that I never considered the possibility that Daniel might have already let me go. That night I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the image of Daniel with that woman replaying in my mind like a cruel movie. I wanted to hate him. I wanted to be angry. But all I felt was a hollow ache in my chest. I thought about the letter I'd written, the letter that started all of this. I'd wanted to hurt him, to make him feel as invisible as I'd felt. But Daniel wasn't invisible. I was, and maybe I always had been. The next morning, I woke up with a stubborn resolve pulsing beneath my skin. Seeing Daniel with that woman had ignited something inside me, not just jealousy, but a fierce, desperate need to reclaim what I'd lost. I wasn't ready to let go. Not yet. I spent the day pacing around the house, replaying every conversation we'd had over the last few months, looking for cracks, for opportunities to wedge myself back into his life. There had to be a way. Daniel wasn't a man of passion, but he wasn't heartless. I just had to remind him of what we had, of who we had been before everything fell apart. By the time evening rolled around, I had a plan. It wasn't much, but it was something. I waited until I heard the familiar sound of his car pulling into the driveway. My heart pounded in my chest, a rhythmic reminder of how much was riding on this. I had dressed carefully, choosing the deep green dress Daniel always liked, The one he said made my eyes stand out. I'd even cooked his favorite meal, roast chicken with rosemary and lemon, the way his mother used to make it. The house smelled warm and inviting, like it used to on the rare nights we entertained guests or celebrated small victories. I dimmed the lights just enough to create the illusion of intimacy, and when I heard his keys in the lock, I positioned myself casually by the kitchen counter, pretending to be busy with the plates. The door opened, and I felt his presence before I saw him. I turned, forcing a smile onto my face. "Hey," I said softly, trying to sound casual. Daniel paused in the doorway, his eyes flicking from the table set for two to me in the dress he hadn't seen in months. His expression was unreadable, but something in his gaze tightened. "What's all this?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. I swallowed hard, my palms suddenly clammy. "I thought we could have dinner, like old times." There was a long, heavy pause. He closed the door behind him but didn't move further into the room. "Claire." His tone was gentle, but there was an edge beneath it. "What are you doing?" I felt the first crack in my resolve, but I pushed through. "I just thought, maybe we could talk. Not about the divorce. Just us." For a moment, I thought he might agree. He stood there staring at me, and I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, recognition maybe, or nostalgia. But then it was gone, replaced by that maddening calm. "Claire," he said again, softer this time. "This won't change anything." My breath hitched, but I forced myself to keep smiling. "It doesn't have to. I miss you, Daniel." He finally stepped into the room, but the space between us felt as vast as ever. "Do you miss me?" he asked quietly. "Or do you miss the idea of me?" The question caught me off guard, and for a moment I didn't know how to respond. Did I miss him, or did I just hate the idea of losing? "I miss us," I whispered, because it was the only truth I could hold on to. Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Claire, there is no us anymore. You made that clear the moment you wrote that letter." I felt the sting of his words like a slap, but I wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. "People make mistakes," I said, my voice trembling despite my best efforts. "I made a mistake, but I'm trying to fix it." He looked at me for a long, agonizing moment, and I saw the flicker of something in his eyes again. But it wasn't hope. It was pity. "I don't need you to fix it, Claire," he said quietly, "because I'm not broken." That night, after he left for wherever he went now, I sat at the dinner table alone, staring at the untouched plates, the candles burning down to nothing but stubs of wax. The house felt colder than it ever had before, and for the first time I realized that Daniel wasn't just moving on. He was already gone. The next morning, I woke to an empty house and an even emptier heart. The realization settled over me like a suffocating blanket. I had lost him, and the worst part, I had no one to blame but myself. The days blurred together after that night. I moved through them like a ghost, drifting from room to room in the house that no longer felt like mine. The walls seemed colder, the silence heavier. Even the sun streaming through the windows felt like it belonged to someone else. Daniel didn't come home that night, or the next. When he did, it was late, and I was already in bed pretending to be asleep. I couldn't face him, not after seeing how completely indifferent he'd become. It was like trying to reach for someone who was already out of the room, the door quietly closing behind them. I thought about leaving. I even packed a bag once, stuffing it with clothes and toiletries, my hands shaking the whole time. But when I stood at the door, suitcase in hand, I froze. Where would I go? I didn't have an answer, so I stayed. It was Sophie who finally pulled me out of the house. She showed up unannounced as usual, but this time she didn't bother knocking. She let herself in with the spare key and found me curled up on the couch, surrounded by empty wine bottles and takeout containers. "Jesus, Claire," she muttered, her nose wrinkling as she surveyed the mess. "It looks like a crime scene in here." I didn't even have the energy to glare at her. "What do you want, Sophie?" "To get you out of this damn house," she said, yanking the blanket off me. "You're starting to smell like regret and cheap Cabernet." "I don't want to go anywhere." She crossed her arms, her expression hardening. "I don't care. You're coming with me." Before I could argue, she grabbed my arm and hauled me to my feet. I didn't have the strength to fight her, so I let her drag me out the door and into her car. She took me to a little cafe downtown, one of those cozy places with mismatched furniture and chalkboard menus. The kind of place Daniel and I used to go when we first moved to Maplewood, back when everything still felt new and full of possibilities. The irony wasn't lost on me. Sophie ordered for both of us, black coffee for her, herbal tea for me, and we sat in a corner booth by the window. I stared out at the street, watching people pass by. their lives moving forward while mine felt stuck in reverse. "You need to pull yourself together," Sophie said after a few minutes of silence. "This isn't you," I snorted, a bitter laugh escaping before I could stop it. "You don't know who I am anymore." She didn't flinch. "Then figure it out." I turned to her, the frustration boiling over. "It's not that simple, Sophie. I lost everything." "No, Claire," she shot back, her eyes flashing. "You lost Daniel, but you haven't lost everything. You're still here. You still have a life to live. So stop acting like it's over." I opened my mouth to argue, but the words caught in my throat. Because deep down, I knew she was right. I just didn't know how to move on. Later that night, after Sophie dropped me off, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the divorce papers still sitting on the dresser. I'd left them there as a kind of sick reminder, but now they felt like an anchor, dragging me down. I picked them up, my fingers tracing the edges of the crisp white paper. I could sign them. I could finally let go, but the thought of it made my chest tighten. What if this is it, I wondered. What if I never feel whole again? The fear was paralyzing, but even worse was the realization that holding on wasn't fixing anything. It was just prolonging the inevitable. I set the papers back down and crawled into bed, pulling the covers up over my head like a child hiding from monsters. But the only monster in this story was me. The next morning, the sunlight streaming through the curtains felt less like an accusation and more like an invitation. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like the walls were closing in on me. There was still an ache in my chest, but it wasn't as sharp as suffocating. It was the kind of ache you get when a wound is finally starting to heal. I sat up in bed and stared at the divorce papers on the dresser. They were still unsigned, but something inside me had shifted. I didn't feel the desperate need to tear them up or cling to them like a life raft. Maybe it's time to let go. The thought was terrifying, but it also felt freeing. I spent the day cleaning the house, not because I thought Daniel would notice or care, but because I needed to reclaim the space. Every corner of the house held a memory, but instead of letting them haunt me, I decided to face them head on. The photo albums tucked away in the living room cabinet, the stack of old birthday cards in the junk drawer, even Daniel's favorite mug, the one I'd been tempted to smash more than once, got a gentle wash and placed carefully back in the cupboard. It wasn't about pretending everything was okay, it was about accepting that it wasn't and realizing that was okay too. That evening, as I was folding laundry in the bedroom, I heard the front door open and close. My heart jumped into my throat, but I forced myself to stay calm. Daniel's footsteps echoed down the hall, steady and familiar. For a moment, I considered hiding in the bathroom, avoiding another tense encounter, but something inside me said no. I was done hiding. I walked out into the living room just as he was setting his keys on the table. He looked up, surprised to see me, but his expression remained unreadable. "Hey," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "Hey," he replied, his tone neutral. An awkward silence settled between us, thick and heavy. I could feel the weight of all the things we hadn't said pressing down on us. Finally, I took a deep breath. "Can we talk?" Daniel studied me for a moment, then nodded. "Sure." We sat on opposite ends of the couch, the distance between us feeling both too far and not far enough. "I've been thinking," I began, my fingers nervously twisting in my lap. "About everything, about us." Daniel didn't interrupt. He just listened, his gaze steady and patient. "I was wrong," I admitted, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. "I thought I wanted something more, something exciting. But what I really wanted was to feel seen, to feel like I mattered." His expression softened, but he didn't say anything. "I blamed you for everything," I continued, my voice cracking. "But it wasn't all your fault. I was looking for happiness in the wrong places, and I didn't realize until it was too late." Daniel sighed, leaning back against the couch. "Claire, I'm not perfect. I know I made mistakes too. But the thing is, I did see you. I just don't think you saw me." The honesty in his voice cut deeper than any accusation ever could. "I see that now," I whispered. For a long moment we just sat there, the silence between us filled with all the things we couldn't change. "I'm not here to beg," I finally said, meeting his gaze. "I know we can't go back, but I needed you to know that I'm sorry, for everything." Daniel nodded slowly, his eyes softening. "Thank you." The simplicity of his response was both a relief and a heartbreak. There were no grand gestures, no promises of reconciliation, just two people finally facing the truth. That night, I signed the divorce papers. It wasn't easy. My hand trembled as I wrote my name, the finality of it hitting me like a punch to the gut. But when it was done, I felt lighter. It wasn't the ending I wanted, but maybe it was the one I needed. The day I dropped the signed divorce papers off at Daniel's office, the world didn't stop spinning, the sky didn't darken, and the earth didn't crack open beneath my feet. It was just another ordinary day in Maplewood, the same streets, the same faces. But as I walked out of that sleek glass building, something inside me felt different, lighter. I had expected to feel hollow, like a part of me had been ripped away, but instead, I felt free. It wasn't the triumphant freedom I'd imagined when I first wrote that letter to Daniel, filled with anger and resentment. This was quieter, a freedom that came from acceptance, from finally letting go of the things that had been weighing me down. I wasn't Daniel's wife anymore, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like me. I moved out of the house 2 weeks later. It was Daniel's house now, and while he never asked me to leave, I knew it was time. Staying there felt like clinging to a life that no longer existed. I found a small apartment downtown, nothing fancy, a one-bedroom with creaky floors and a kitchen that barely fit a table, but it was mine. I painted the walls a soft sage green, filled the space with thrift store finds, and even bought myself a new coffee mug to replace the one I'd always used at home. It wasn't much, but it felt like a fresh start. Sophie came over the first night, a bottle of cheap champagne in one hand and a pizza in the other. "To new beginnings," she toasted, raising her glass. "To figuring things out," I replied, clinking my glass against hers. We spent the evening on the floor, laughing over old stories and making plans for the future, plans that didn't revolve around anyone but me. In the months that followed, I started to rebuild, not just my life but myself. I picked up old hobbies I'd long forgotten, like painting and hiking the trails outside of town. I even started taking a pottery class at the community center, something I'd always wanted to do but never made time for. At first it felt strange, like I was trying on someone else's life, but the more I leaned into it, the more natural it became. I wasn't the same Claire who'd written that letter to Daniel, desperate for excitement and validation. I was someone new, someone stronger. I ran into Daniel once at the farmer's market. He was with her, the woman I'd seen him with outside his office. They were holding hands, laughing about something I couldn't hear. When he spotted me, there was a brief flicker of surprise in his eyes, followed by a small, genuine smile. "Hey Claire," he greeted, his voice warm but distant. "Hey Daniel," I replied, my heart surprisingly steady. We exchanged a few polite words before going our separate ways, and as I walked away, I realized something that stunned me. I didn't feel jealous. I didn't feel angry. I felt happy for him, because he deserved to be happy, and so did I. One evening, as I was walking home from the pottery studio, the sky painted in hues of pink and orange, I paused on the bridge overlooking the river that ran through town. The water shimmered in the fading light, a soft breeze rustling the leaves on the trees lining the banks. I thought about everything that had happened, the love, the betrayal, the heartbreak. It wasn't the story I thought I'd live, but it was my story. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of where it would go next. I pulled out my phone and sent a quick text to Sophie. "Me, thinking about a weekend trip. You in?" Her reply came almost instantly. "Sophie, hell yes. Let's make some new memories." I smiled, slipping my phone back into my pocket, because that's what life was about now. Not the endings, but the new beginnings.